Well, thanks everybody for coming. I'm Bryan Bender, and I'm hoping you came here for me. Otherwise, why would you be with me? I was thinking on the way over here, I had a park sort of far away that you would think the aliens would have thought ahead and not landed in July, like November, December, when it's beautiful in these parks. But at least it's not so cool in here, which is different from yesterday. So who am I? Why am I here? I asked that question a lot in the last couple of days. So my name is Bryan Bender. I'm the senior national correspondent for Politico, which, as you may know or may not know, is a news website based in Washington, D.C., founded about 15 years ago. It covers politics, policy, obviously campaigns, political campaigns. And Politico is sort of like, we call it a teenager on Ritalin. It's started 15 years ago with about a dozen people and is now a $1 billion company, 600 to 700 reporters all over America, all over Europe, and a couple of places in between. And I came to Politico in 2015 as the defense editor. My background as a journalist was primarily national security, military affairs. I covered the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I spent a long time covering the defense industry, aerospace companies, and also a little bit of the intelligence agencies, the spy world. But for 20 plus years as a reporter, there was never a time that I ever wrote about UFOs. It just was not an issue that mainstream news media ever really covered. If it ever came up on the radar, it was, I do remember a press conference. It was held at the National Press Club in Washington more than a decade ago. There was a bunch of former military officers who were coming forward to talk about their experiences with UFOs, or as the Pentagon now calls them, unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs. But I didn't go to that press conference because it was sort of like, a bunch of guys are going to talk about UFOs. It just wasn't really something that, at least in my world, people took very seriously. I think the only time it actually was something that I worked on was maybe a couple of years before I came to Politico. There was a website that had digitized all of the Project Blue Book files. So put them all online, electronically searchable. And I remember I was at the Boston Globe at the time as a Pentagon reporter, and an intern assigned to me who kind of had nothing to do. So I said, hey, why don't you go through the Blue Book files and write a fun little story about like all the cool UFO sightings in New England. Because I figured for the Boston Globe, that's how we can write something for our audience. So he had a lot of fun with that, and I had some fun editing it. But I say all this because I think it helps understand a little bit how significantly the conversation about UFOs has changed just in the last couple of years. So fast forward to 2017, I was still a defense editor. So I was overseeing a team of reporters who covered the Pentagon and Congress and national security, and I got a tip from a source of mine who I had known years before. I hadn't talked to him in quite a while. He said, hey, not sure if this is something you'd be interested in, but there is an official in the Pentagon, a career government civilian, who is working on UFOs. And he's about to retire or leave government service. And he's quite frustrated about sort of his experience, what he's learned, most importantly, his feeling that the government, at least his superiors in the Department of Defense, don't take the issue of UFO sightings very seriously. And he's going to be retiring, and he wants to go public. He wants to talk about his frustrations. He wants to talk about, to the extent that he can, without revealing secrets, he wants to talk about his experience. And at first, I said to this guy, I said, well, sounds like an interesting story, but, I'd have to learn a whole lot more about who this guy is, what this organization he's reportedly working for has been doing. And so that's kind of how it started for me. I started writing about the topic because, quite frankly, it was a good story. You had basically a whistleblower coming forward saying, the government's not paying enough attention to UFOs. By the way, it won't surprise any of you that government official was Lou Elizondo, who's going to speak after me today. And so over the course of several months, I met Lou, I interviewed him, I looked into his background, I vetted sort of the origin of this office that he was running called ATIP, the Advanced Aerial Threat Identification Program. And the more I dug into it, the more it was an interesting and I thought newsworthy story, not just that the Pentagon in modern day was once again dedicating at least some resources to studying the phenomenon. But as I learned, it was also a program that was started by Senator Harry Reid of Nevada, who had an abiding interest in the topic. It was very influential in the Senate. He got $22 million tucked into the defense budget back in 2007, I think it was. And so they had a political angle to it too. It wasn't just Pentagon studying UFOs, but here's kind of the politics of it. Why does the Senator of Nevada care about this? And then I learned, oh, by the way, a lot of that $22 million, which was for research, studies, and the like, and also interviewing pilots and other governments and others were having experiences that are important sightings. A lot of the money that was dedicated to Lou Elizondo's program went to Bigelow Aerospace, which was a contractor that had been involved in researching some of these topics for quite a long time, but it is owned by Robert Bigelow, who, lo and behold, it turns out, was a huge campaign contributor to Senator Harry Reid. So that was interesting to me too. So you have this UFO senator creating an office, and then most of the money for the research went to his campaign contributor, fellow Nevada, Bob Bigelow, who also, it turned out, I learned, as many of you may know if you've heard of him, also at one point owned Skinwalker Ranch in Utah, where a lot of the initial interest in UFO sightings and broader paranormal topics that really got Harry Reid interested came from. So Skinwalker Ranch played kind of a huge role in this origin story, how the Pentagon kind of got back into the business of publicly got back into the business of studying UFOs. So that was sort of the first batch of news stories, late 2017. We covered it, the New York Times covered it, and it got picked up by a lot of other mainstream news organizations. And I think what was different was that if the mainstream media had covered UFOs, it was always kind of a little bit of a giggle and ha-ha kind of topic. Like, oh, there was a sighting here or a sighting there. But it tended to be more tabloid coverage. It was the tabloids that covered the topic, and not in a very serious way. And I think what happened in 2017 was sort of a confluence of factors. You had Lou Elizondo, who was, by all accounts, a credible government official who had 20 plus years of experience, mostly in the counterterrorism world, not in the UFO world at all, coming forward and saying, hey, I'm fed up. I've been looking into this, and this is a real phenomenon. We don't really know exactly what it is necessarily, but why are we not doing more? You had Navy pilots that came forward publicly who were quite credible, saying they had these experiences. We learned about some relatively recent incidents involving the USS Nimitz aircraft carrier in 2004. There were other cases more recently, the USS Theodore Roosevelt, another aircraft carrier that reported to be dogged by these tic-tac-shaped, unidentified aircraft that were exhibiting all these aerial dynamics that no one could explain. And so you had the Navy pilots, Lou Elizondo, who had at that point, Harry Reid was actually retired from the Senate, but still had a fairly high-profile reputation in politics in Washington. he was talking publicly about the role that he played. And so I think it was an opportunity to kind of delve into this subject in a more serious way. And I think it was clear that the stigma was also lessening. The stigma of talking about it, being associated with it. And I think while it wasn't necessarily something I ever thought about as a Pentagon reporter before, I do think that there was this feeling that, there's a moment here now where if you write about this topic, you're not going to automatically be ridiculed or automatically be somehow marginalized. And so the first stories led to more stories because, I think the first thing that happened after 2017 was that there were sitting members of Congress who read those stories in the New York Times or Politico or elsewhere who were like, hey, I want to know more about this. This sounds like a real thing. And I'm on the Armed Services Committee or I'm on the Intelligence Committee and I haven't heard about this. So that began a series of briefings where you had initially just kind of a handful of members of Congress who stood up and called the Pentagon and said, hey, I want a briefing. I want you to come up here for me and my staff. I want to hear more about this. And that's when I think Mr. Elizondo went up and briefed some of these members. They brought some of the Navy pilots from Washington to share their testimony. And so it was a snowball from there. Another thing that happened about a year later is the Navy issued guidelines, official guidelines for all of their personnel on how to report a UFO. And that, I think, was a big deal because I think one of the problems related to the stigma of the topic is that even within the government, no one really ever wanted to be the UFO person because it was not seen as a career builder. It was seen as kind of a career killer, really. And so to have the Navy officially say to all of its personnel, if you see something unusual, here is the form you fill out, here's who you send it to, we want to start collecting evidence. And that, in turn, again, led to more interest, more hearing, more briefings for Congress. And that kind of brings us maybe a little bit closer to where we are today, where we've now seen in the last 2 years or so, Congress stepping up and actually writing new laws that mandate that the Pentagon and intelligence agencies do a much better job and set up a much more coordinated effort to gather up any information they might have about UAPs, as they call them, unidentified aerial phenomena, as part of an effort to try and collect more data, get a better picture, a fuller picture, maybe what military personnel are seeing. And why is that important? I think everybody in this room probably agrees, and maybe you wouldn't be here if you didn't, that the government clearly knows more about UFOs than they do. But I think what I've learned in the last couple of years, and I do not consider myself by any means a UFO researcher, UFOologist, I'm just a reporter who happened to cover the military. I believe the government does have more information, but I think because of the way the national security agencies are structured, when someone says the Pentagon says this, or the CIA says that, my question immediately is, well, who in the Pentagon? Who in the CIA? Because these are not monolithic organizations. In fact, they're the opposite. They are fiefdoms within fiefdoms within fiefdoms within fiefdoms, layered on top by a massive system of classification and secrecy. They're all agencies that are designed in their DNA not to share information. In fact, it's the opposite. It's to keep secrets. Because we don't want the bad guys to know what we're doing, or what new weapon we're building, or who we've enlisted to be our sources of information across the world. So if you take that into account, I think it's quite rational to come to the conclusion that yes, the government knows more. But it doesn't mean that the head of the CIA or Secretary of Defense or the President, or even senior to mid-level bureaucrats actually know what their own agencies know. Because if they're not in the room for the briefing, if they're not cleared to be involved in that secret program, they just simply don't know. And I think that's the challenge that Congress now is trying to get at, which is how do we collect up all the bits and pieces that may still be there to build this clearer picture? Because I'm pretty convinced that there are more puzzle pieces inside government agencies and archives. You know, by the way, defense contractors. Because I think if you have secrets and you want to keep them from the public, you go to Lockheed Martin or Boeing and you say, you keep the secrets for us, because the Freedom of Information Act, which is a tool for a journalist like me to get information out of the government, even if it takes forever. I can't file a FOIA request to a company. It's not covered by the law. So what a way to hide things and almost ensure that it'll never get out. And as somebody pointed out on a panel last night, I had forgotten this, but of the 1.2 million people in America that have security clearance, the majority of them are private contractors who work for the government. So they're not even public officials. So I lay all that out because I think where we are today is we have Congress much more interested in the public. And I think that's a function of our culture has changed. I think the stigma has lessened. They're not so worried about talking about the topic in public. And I also think that they're genuinely curious about what does the government know. And oh, by the way, it's my job, it's their job to actually know it, because they're the oversight entities, they're the people's representatives. And so I think what they're trying to do in writing some of this new legislation, forcing more collection, more analysis, more reports and comments, is to try and surface all of the little pockets of things that might still exist, either from recent times or maybe from 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, or even as far back as 1947. And it's a work in progress. I mean, this is an institution, or institutions, like the Pentagon and national security agencies, that don't want to give up stuff. And they also don't want to admit that they had hidden stuff. And I think most of all, if you believe like I do, they don't have all the answers. They're not hiding things because they want to hide the knowledge. They're hiding things because they want to hide the ignorance. In other words, it's very difficult if you're the head of the Air Force to come forward to the American public and say, my job is to protect American Air Force. See the shining sea. The reason why the Air Force exists is to do that. And we can't do it because there's these things flying around in and out of our airspace, over our protected military bases, and someone can do it. Nobody wants to admit that. So they're much more, there's a much bigger incentive for them to keep it secret. But again, before I wrap up and maybe open it for questions, my point of view is that it's not because the government has all the answers, they're communicating with the alien civilizations and they don't want us to know. I think they don't want us to know because they don't fully know. And if there is very advanced technologies out there that we're seeing, and maybe even we collected pieces of somewhere a while away in Lockheed Martin complex in Colorado or California or pick your defense out there. We also don't want the Russians and the Chinese to know that we have it, because this could potentially be technology, if you can figure out how to use it, that could be very threatening to us if it got into the wrong hands. And so a lot of the secrecy is around not just what they know or don't know, but the fear that by telling us everything, they're revealing some sort of clues about how they learn what they do know. You know, they call it sources and methods in the government. And a lot of times they don't want to share things because, oh, well, if we tell you we saw that on this day from this position, maybe that's revealing what we might have seen it with. And we don't want bad guys to know that. Now, of course, that is abused all the time. They use that as an excuse to not share it. Well, sources and methods, sources and methods. But I do think there is an element of this level of secrecy that is sort of justifiable reason when they say that. I feel like rather than just jabbering on, you guys have questions? I'm happy to answer what I can about my own reporting and my own experience, but also if I don't know.
So, sources and numbers. How come UAP can't convey to the senators in the addressing Congress who are fired? Like, hey, so I'm asking about this. We really need to keep this. Why are they, in your view, continue? It seems like conversation when it comes to politicians, and that there's some agenda there for these individual politicians to push this.
That's a good question. But I think there's no doubt that the Defense Department, if it had its way, would have no part of this debate with it. I mean, even if you go back to this program that Harry Reid set up, it was listed on the paper. I mean, it was basically Congress demanding you go do this. And so I think if that Pentagon had its druthers, it doesn't want more transparency, it doesn't want to talk about this stuff, it wants to do its thing and be left alone. And I think they've made that, I think some of the Pentagon have made that clear. Some of the other intelligence agencies have made that clear to Congress. But I genuinely have come to believe that there's just enough genuine interest in Congress among some of these members that there isn't really a sort of deep dark agenda other than they strongly believe in more transparency, that the public deserves to know if there are things you can't share which will not harm national security, then they should know. And I also think there's a little bit of a sense of resentment driving them too, which is I'm on the Intelligence Committee, I'm on the Armed Services Committee, I have the power. You know, in our three branches of government, the legislative branch has a significant amount of power over the other ones, including oversight of the executive branch. And I think there's some of that driving it too, which is like, why do we not know this stuff? If you have some of this information, we have the clearances, we have this, you know, the secret compartmentalized information facility, SCIF, up in the Capitol, where we can have secret meetings and hear about classified information about, you know, military operations, intelligence gathering, you know. So I think that's driving them too. You know, when I call my talk the UFO caucus, I don't mean it to indicate that there's like a massive number of members of Congress who go to work every day saying, where the hell are the UFOs? You know, they have a lot on their plates, as you know, and they're also quite dysfunctional. Maybe quite understandable. They don't get a whole lot done. And so it's not like Congress is, you know, this is like the top of the agenda. But there is, I'd say maybe a dozen or so members of the House and the Senate, most of which sit on these committees I just mentioned, so that they have sort of an equity in this. Part of their role is oversight of these agencies. I think they genuinely want to sort of beat some of this stuff out of the government and force it to get its head out of the sand and do a much more effective job of trying to maybe find some answers, or at least get on the road to putting those puzzle pieces together into a clearer picture. Because, again, as I said earlier, I don't think you can discount the stigma. Not just the stigma publicly about being interested in UFOs, the stigma within the government. There's a lot of resistance to even touch this. It's like considered kryptonite. It's why the Air Force is MIA on this issue. I mean, when you read news stories, it's like Navy pilots, or the Navy for quite a bit of time over the last few years was running this Pentagon task force that was looking into UAPs. And everybody said, where's the Air Force? Where's the Air Force? I mean, the Air Force, of course, has information. But the Air Force also looks back at Project Blue Book and sees no winning in this issue. It doesn't matter what we say, what we do, you know, whether you believe that it's a cover-up or not, it's a PR nightmare from their perspective. And like I said before, the other piece of it, I think, which is a big part, is you don't want to be the guy known for being the Air Force Chief of Staff who admitted that we can't protect American airspace. And so it's a long way of answering your question, but I think individually maybe members of Congress have an agenda. I mean, I'm not going to say every single one of them doesn't have some idea in their mind of what they're going to get out of this.
It does seem like it lends some validity to the conspiracy mindset of some members of Congress. Oh, we can do this, and say, well, here's a major conspiracy that is happening that we has opened the door for all sorts of.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few members who have spoken out that have focused on kind of the conspiracy. His name is escaping me now. As you can see, but he, sort of one example is accusing the Pentagon of the other agencies of lying to us for 75 years. And, it's way past time to tell us all the goodies that you know. But that's the minority, I think, of the members of Congress. If you listen to Senator Marco Rubio in Florida, who has been a leading force in all this. He's written some of the legislation. He's met repeatedly with some of the pilots. He's spent quite a bit of time on this subject. If you listen to Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, who's another, she's a Democrat. She's also co-sponsored some of the legislation. They're just two examples. But if you listen to them talk about it, they tend to talk about it in national security terms, not in, I want to know where the alien bodies are, and it's time for them to tell us. It's more, you're telling us that there's these things, and they're really advanced, and some of them, a lot of them, you just can't explain. And take the Nimitz example, for example, the USS Nimitz aircraft carrier. So an aircraft carrier battle group, which is the aircraft carrier itself, with an air wing, with all sorts of accompanying ships, surface ships, submarines, it's called an aircraft carrier battle group. That unit alone is probably the most protected part of our military arsenal than anything else, maybe with the exception of nuclear weapons. But by the way, the Nimitz has a nuclear reactor because it's a nuclear powered aircraft carrier, so it's basically a nuclear power plant floating at sea. But from Marco Rubio's point of view, that's the most protected, one of the most protected assets we have. And you're telling me that there's these things that are basically rendering all of your defenses useless. Why are you not more concerned about this? And so I think that drives a lot of these members who are on these committees, because to them it's like it's a blind spot. I mean, set aside for a moment whether you think it's aliens, or you think they're from another dimension, or you think they're Russians, or Chinese, or whatever. I mean, set that aside from a basic, just sort of military operation oversight perspective. Why are we not putting more resources to trying to figure out this is done? And so I think that's the majority of the leaders of Congress. There are some around who are like, conspiracy, it's time to come forward. And I think you saw some of that at the congressional hearing a couple of weeks ago, the first one, public hearing in 57 years, where there were some questions about, where the alien bodies effectively, have you ever heard of that, or do we have crashed UFOs? So there's certainly an element of that. I mean, these members of Congress and their staff, they're people too. They watch TV, they read all the books that we read, and so I think there's some of that driving it, but I think it's just one element of it. The back.
Yeah, so when y'all were doing the stories about the UFOs, did you just based off what information was already available, or did y'all do any kind of new research or anything like that? And then my second part is, what is your personal opinion of the phenomenon?
The first question, the answer is yes, but with a caveat in terms of other research. I mean, obviously you can't cover a topic like this with so much history, so much scar tissue, quite frankly, without at least dipping yourself into a little bit of that and trying to find experts, historians that you feel are credible, or one of the people that I went to, Alejandro Rojas, who I think spoke this morning, was on the panel tonight, last night, we'll get tonight. He was somebody that I went to sort of, almost as like a guide. Like, I'm peering into this rabbit hole, can you sort of help me? because I don't want to fall in completely, because you can't go down this tributary or that one. So, what do people like him? Who should I read? What experts should I talk to sort of get a sense of where we are now? In other words, revealing the Pentagon office, congressional interest, what I just described. How does that fit into the bigger picture? And so I say yes with a caveat, because I also made a sort of conscious decision, and I'm pretty sure even 4 years later it was the right one, although sometimes they question it, which was that I wasn't going to go too far down the path of this sighting or that experience, even things like Roswell, because I felt like, I'm a national security reporter, I'm not a UFO reporter. So maybe the contribution I can make is to sort of cover the government paper trail as we know it today. What is the Pentagon doing today? What are they saying versus what are they doing? In other words, oftentimes they say they're doing this, but it turns out they're really doing that. So sort of focusing on that, focusing on the congressional piece, focusing on the new law writing, and then also the accountability piece. Okay, so the Congress wants the Pentagon to do A, B, C, and D. Are they answering the mail? Or a year later, are they doing what they were supposed to be doing? If not, why not? So I really tried to stick to my lane, quite frankly, because I feel like I'm not going to add a whole lot to sort of the bigger picture, because it's just not my background. I mean, it doesn't mean that I don't look into some cases. The Nimitz case, obviously, I delved into that because that was driving a lot of the conversation in Washington. There's these pilots who, were still around and could talk about what they saw. I looked into, when I was doing a longer magazine piece about, this was last summer, about the origin story about sort of how we got here. In other words, why is Washington talking so much about UFOs? I did get a little interested in the Phoenix Lights incident because I live in Scottsdale, Arizona most of the time these days. And, that one was always interesting to me because it was so unique. So many people saw it. So the second question was, what do I think? I get that question a lot. And I usually answer it this way. First of all, I don't think there's likely a single answer. There's probably multiple truths. It's pretty clear that a lot of sightings are explainable in some fashion if you do the due diligence and get the right people and the right science. Obviously, there is a category, a very stubborn and not insignificant category that are truly unexplainable and seem to defy a lot of things that you think of as sort of known physics. So could it be? There's always so many things that they can be, right? One that comes up a lot, of course, is it's a secret U.S. classified program that they really don't want to talk about, and they're going out of their way to layer on such a propaganda operation to keep it secret. I think that's a possibility. I think it's remote, because I think we now have seen enough people come forward with very senior clearances who should know about those programs, who are either doing an amazingly good job of lying bald-faced with the American people, or signaling that it's very likely not one of ours. And I think it's significant that the public report that came out about a year ago from the Director of National Intelligence, which Marco Rubio requested, states explicitly these are not ours. The ones that we can't explain, they are not U.S. program. And that's significant. I mean, you could be conspiracy theorists and say they're lying, but just the fact that they put that out on the table is not ours. So let's move that aside. Could it be Russian, Chinese, Israeli, French, whatever? Some foreign country has made a breakthrough. Again, not impossible, but I think remote, because first of all, the Nimitz happened 20 years ago. So they've kept that secret for 20 years. I mean, that would be the biggest intelligence failure on our parts. It would be bigger than 9/11. If somebody had made this breakthrough, we didn't know. And by the way, to go back to the first one, U.S. secret plane is a possibility. Planes, drones, or whatever. If that were true, and I thought of this very early on, from my perspective as a reporter, that would be a huge story, because that's a government within a government. in other words, the congressional oversight committees, the senior Pentagon intelligence officials who are supposed to know about that stuff, don't know. That's a threat to democracy. So that would be a huge story. But again, I think 1 and 2, as I just mentioned, possibilities possible but remote. And then you get to, I've thought of this, could these pilots be hallucinating? Remote. Almost impossible, because the radar operator on the Princeton saw too. And that's the thing that I think I should also mention that I think has changed the conversation. Even 20 years ago, somebody could come forward. I'm a pilot and I saw a Foo Fighter go, in the night. You can kind of dismiss that because it's like one person or maybe two said they saw it. Now you have a radar here, a radar there, a submarine here, a plane there, and they're picking these things up. 4, 5, 6, 7 different sensors. You can't just write that off as though somebody thought they saw something. But is it possible that you could hack into those systems and populate it with something that's going like this and that, and get what the hell is that? Again, possible, but I feel like that's really remote. And then the last possibility is the sort of none of the above. And I think it's probably that. I don't know what the none of the above is specifically, but these reports have gone on for even long before Roswell, right? Pretty much throughout the course of human history, there's some element of this phenomenon in some fashion. And so, I think it fits into that. What is that? Who knows? But I do think it's interesting that the Pentagon office and Harry Reid did a study. You can't see the whole study because I think it's classified, but they did release some summaries and titles of it. And somebody, through the Freedom of Information Act, was able to kick out at least some sense of what they spent the money on. Where did the $22 million go? And one of the studies was on multidimensional travel. So it was a theoretical study where they hired a scientist. They gave them all the data they had from the Tic Tac experience on the Nimitz and others. It basically said if a vehicle could do this, go from the surface of the ocean to 70,000 feet in 3 seconds, and not explode, and it doesn't have any wings, it doesn't seem to have a power plant or a propulsion system, how would you make something like that? How could that be? And the study basically said, well, maybe they're not from far away, they're from here. They're just from a different here. And they're, the aliens, or whatever you want to call them, don't live billions of light years away. Because, first of all, think about it. If they're that advanced, why would they come here? And unless they figured out how to cut through space and time. 1 million light years is 1 million light years for them at the speed of light, too. And so, why would they send a drone? Why would you send a biological being all that distance if you didn't have to? So again, I'm not saying I think that's the answer, but it gives you some sense of where the thinking, even within the government, is going, which is this may be totally off the charts, something that we know, and maybe we'll never know. But I do think there's a real desire to try and get at least a little further down the path of maybe not finding the answer, but being able to. A lot of the intelligence business is not finding the answer; it's figuring out what's not the answer. It's a process of elimination, right? It's like, okay, this happened. What's the explanation? We know it's not that. We know it's not that. We know it's not that. That seems to steadily narrow down what it might really be. Those are all the answers, sorry. Gentlemen in the back.
I've heard a lot about the involvement of various branches of the military, but I'm curious about the Space Force.
Space Force. That's a good question. So the Space Force is new, 3 years old officially, its own military branch. From what I understand, and I think this is now public, Lou Elizondo is now a contractor for the Space Force, a consultant of sorts on this particular topic. I think, like a lot of organizations in the military, there's sort of a tug of war going on within the Space Force. How much do we want to take on this mission publicly, or even not publicly? I think there's still concern that it's kind of a PR disaster. The Space Force is already kind of ridiculed. It's kind of butt of jokes for for good and bad. And so I think there's some debate. But from what I understand, the Space Force is answering the mail. I mean, they know Congress wants more answers, and they are presumably not just the Space Force, but the Space Command, which is sort of separate but connected. Space Command is basically the military headquarters in Colorado Springs, and it's responsible for space operations. So if they had to go to war and they had to knock out enemy satellites or protect our own satellites, it would be Space Command's job to do that. Whereas the Space Force, its job is basically to prepare and train the space guardians, as they call them, to be able to go do that work for Space Command. So Space Command, I know, is doing some things to try and collect more data. They brought on some more analysts to look at this problem. But again, it's a very small number of people. It's not like this is a tidal wave of interest. I think one thing that will be interesting to watch about the Space Force is, I mentioned the Air Force. Well, the Space Force is part of the Department of the Air Force. It's called its own branch, and it is in many ways, but the Secretary of the Air Force runs the Space Force. So a lot of this will be determined by what the Air Force is willing to do. I'm not sure how much the Space Force will be able to get out of its lane if the big boss in the Air Force doesn't want them to. Space Force is like the Marine Corps. Marine Corps is part of the Public Navy. It's its own distinct service, but it still answers to the bureaucrats that run the Navy. So the Space Force is set up basically the same way with the Air Force. So the question was, is there sort of kind of what is the process for the government determining what is classified information, what doesn't need to be classified and can be made public? How does that process work? It's a great question. I think, from what I understand, and it's mainly from talking to people who live and breathe in that world, because as a journalist, obviously I never had a clearance and I could never get one, nor would I want one, quite frankly, because I'm not very good at keeping secrets. They wouldn't want to get me a clearance. I'd be calling my reporter friends, like, you're not going to believe this. I think it's somewhat arbitrary. And there are certain officials that have the authority to classify things and have the authority to declassify things. I think anyone you talk to in the government, out of the government, who are specialists on the classification system will say there's enormous overclassification. The level of abuse, in other words, using the classification system to keep things from the public, is legendary. I mean, and I've seen this even myself on other topics that I've researched, trudging up to the National Archives in College, Maryland, to go look through old files, stuff that was declassified before I was born. And it's amazing sometimes what you find in those. I mean, it's like the Time Magazine news was put in a classified folder. And, actually some classified, and some Time Magazine. But I use that as an example, like, of this sort of abusing it. And I think there are laws on the books about what they call automatic classification. In other words, there's different categories of information that after 25 years, after 50 years, 75 years, by law have to be made public, unless you can go to a very small group of government officials, agency heads, and even the president, and make the argument, you know what, 75 years later, we still can't release this stuff. And, but again, a big problem there is the backlog. The government only has so many functionaries whose job is to go page by page, declassify something because the law says it's time to declassify. So the backlog of stuff is now 30 years. It should have been released, but isn't because it hasn't gone through a declassification review. Because again, the law says you can't just take the document out of the folder and say, here you go. Like, you have to have someone with a clearance to look at it. Because, oftentimes they will release files that redact things, so black out a line, black out a name, because they make the argument that even this many years later, that person's still alive, or they were an informant, so we don't want to reveal it. And so it's an awful process. I mean, it doesn't work well. And because it doesn't work well, I think it tends to end up on the side of just whenever there's a question, classified, make it secret. And so, it's for us, it's really difficult because even if you file a FOIA for something and you know exactly what you're looking for, because somebody told you there's a report dated this, here's who wrote it, which is great information for me because that helps me then write the request. Because, if I wrote to the government and said, I want all your UFO files, I would die and I would get nothing. Because they would write me a letter back saying, you need to be more specific. And then I would write something back and they'd say, you need to be more specific. And so, the more you know up front, the better. But even those requests for something very specific, you can wait a year. Sometimes, I still have on my desk at home a letter from the CIA responding to my FOIA request 14 years ago, 15. It was like an update. Like, by law, they have to send me a note every 6 months saying, I haven't forgotten about you, I'm working on it, but I keep getting them, and it's like, at this point, I wrote the story 15 years ago, so, I'm not gonna, I don't expect to be anything great in it, but yeah, it's not a very useful system for public transparency. Not at all.
So they work as well. Also, too, for that, given that the many years ago,
So how credible do you think the stuff they are revealing is? That's a good question. I tend to think one thing that I've learned that I think bears on this is that the military branches themselves are very different cultures. That should be no surprise to anybody. Even if you watch movies or television, there's these sort of subtle and sometimes not so subtle differences. The Navy, in my experience, is wired to be more transparent culturally. The Navy, for example, is a public affairs officer of the Navy, which is basically a spokesperson, for generations now, is a dedicated career specialty for a naval officer. You spend 30 years in the Navy as a naval affairs officer. The Air Force, for many, many years, being a public affairs officer was basically a second job, almost like a minor in college, to your main specialty. It was not considered a true full career. And so the Air Force did not have the kind of training that the Navy did about media relations and the First Amendment, and why our role is to be as transparent as we can be, within reason. And I think that has bearing on this, because I think culturally the Air Force, if you're the Air Force general, the public affairs officer is like the last guy who's brought into the meeting, or if he is or she is brought into the meeting, it's at the last minute to write the damn press release because we got to admit that this is happening. Or we want to put this out because we want the public to know. Whereas the Navy public affairs officer, in my experience, sits in the room in every meeting and is contributing, helping to shape the decisions. And so I think that bears on this because I think the Air Force, yes, there's all that spark issue, but I think just culturally they're not as forward leaning in terms of just the engagement with the public and the role that we do have. Maybe a small role, but it is a role, which is we got to tell the public what we're doing. We have to, that's part of our job. The first part of your question was whether the members of Congress, they have access to all these secret programs. Why did they not more fully know? Not all of them. I mean, certain members of Congress, certainly on these committees like intelligence, particularly intelligence committees, are read in, so to speak, on some of these very secret programs. But, I think one of the things that Congress is frustrated about is trying to get a better answer is, there's something in the world of secret government programs called a Special Access Program, SAP, which is, if you have secret, if you have classified, secret, top secret, these sort of various levels. The one that's all the way to the tippy top is SAP. So it is a very, very secret, above top secret program, and only very few people are permitted to have access to it. What's that? I'm not sure, but I'm not sure sort of where they fit exactly in the sort of hierarchy, but it's safe to say that a SAP is a very highly protected program, even within the secret realms of the government. In other words, there's many people with very high security clearances that would not have access unless they were specifically authorized to be part of that special access program. And I think there's some suspicion, I don't think there's a lot of evidence yet, but there's a lot of chatter that there are a lot more SAPs now than there used to be, that they've created more of them, to keep things separate, to keep things, even from other government agencies, that they don't want, to share. And then there's this whole question of sort of, somebody called it like SAPs that are off the books. Like there could be this whole netherworld of some of these programs that even the members of Congress and even some of the senior people of the Pentagon or the CIA aren't ready to do. And if you ask me, what would those SAPs be about? Clearly, this issue would probably be one that I would say would fall into that category. So I'm not saying that that's what we're hiding all the UFO secrets, but the classification system, like I said earlier, sort of fiefdoms and fiefdoms, layers upon layers of secrets. I think it's not easy, even if you have the authority in the law, to just stand up and say, "Tell me what you know." And that gets to another challenge, and I've talked about this before, which is the lack of institutional knowledge. I mean, how many people where they work, or some civic organization they're involved with for some period of time, has had the experience where you're like, we already did this once. We're reinventing the wheel again. We already had a program like this. So yeah, but we're doing it again, let's start it over again. That's an enormous problem with the government. There's a lack of institutional knowledge, even on this issue. Even if the Pentagon had secrets about UFOs 20, 30, 40 years ago, there's no guarantee that there's anybody currently in those agencies who actually knows that stuff. Because if I was the guy who had the portfolio for 30 years and I retired and moved to Florida, it doesn't necessarily mean that I took all that stuff and gave it to the 25-year-old woman who took my job, or that she was read in on those programs. Because again, it's this sort of hydra-headed system where it's not monolithic. It's not like everything goes to the top, and the top can look down and see what's in the middle. I mean, we know for a fact that the CIA ran covert operations programs with the mafia, with criminals, with all sorts of bad apples that the bosses up at the top never knew. So I think that could be very possible on this topic too. There's puzzle pieces, but even finding the puzzle pieces is going to require putting together a puzzle. You need to know where they are, and even if they even still exist. I didn't really hear the first part. You said there was a law?
Yeah, there's a law.
legalized 8,000 USs.
I'm not aware of that, specifically. But I get that question in some fashion a lot. I mean, reporters get rolled all the time, just like we do in everyday life. I mean, I think part of our job, my job, is not just to report what the government says, but to report what the government is doing. I mean, I can go to the press conference and they can say, we're doing this and we're announcing this new initiative. And, that's a day one story. Obviously, it might be newsworthy to write what they say. But my job after that is to then go see what they're actually doing. And as far as propaganda, purposely planting false stories in the media, I'm not going to say that doesn't happen. I mean, I would sort of be an idiot to say that never happens. So of course it does. One of the things you have to do as a reporter, and I teach this to students when I teach at Arizona State University, is you have a real challenge, but it's a crucial part of your job, which is to figure out why your sources are telling you what they're telling you, especially if it's in the national security realm, where by definition people aren't just chatty to be chatty. Everyone's got an axe to grind. Everyone's got an agenda. Some bigger agendas than others. Some it's maybe not that nefarious of an agenda. Maybe for some it's like, I feel so strongly about this topic that I feel that others should know. That's an agenda. But it also, if it's too strong, they could be selectively telling you what they think you should know to write the story that they want you to write. And so as far as the government sort of in an organized way doing that, I think there's no doubt the intelligence agencies, we know this from public records, have made up stories. I think historically those have been planted in the foreign press more than in the domestic press. But of course, in modern history, I think if we look at the run up to the Iraq War and how much that was a coordinated effort versus a sort of organically growing effort to sort of build support for the war among people at high levels of the government who thought that it was something we needed to do. I don't know which of those is true, but I do know that the end result was you had people sharing information that was either not true or incomplete, and big name reporters running with those stories and blazing them on the front page. And I look back at that as a reporter at the time, and there's a couple stories I did that I'm proud of that were sort of kind of wait a second stories, where I talked to people in the government and experts who were like, I'm not sure that Iraq has these weapons of mass destruction. But by and large, I think we all sort of drank the Kool-Aid. And it wasn't because we were purposely trying to lie to the American people. It's that, the access we had, the information we were getting, was obviously coming from people that were selective about what they were telling us. They had an agenda. It doesn't mean that they lied to us, but, they didn't necessarily tell us that, this piece of information, came from this agency. There were two other agencies that raised flags about it and said, hey, maybe that's not true. They sort of left that part out. And obviously it's our job to try to dig deeper and find those things. We're humans too. We have a deadline. We got to get the story together. And I think what's changed in my business too from when I started is it's so hyper-competitive. It's really bad for the truth. It's just terrible for the truth, how competitive it's going. Because it's like, you got to get it first. You gotta beat the competition, and oftentimes that means doing the story in 3 hours, as opposed to 3 days, back when I was a young reporter, where you could actually go do some education, and you could learn a few things, talk to a few more people, get some more perspective, as opposed to this bang, 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 everything that's going on. And it makes it easier, by the way, for people who want to write stuff to do books, if you're not careful. But I don't think that's any phenomenon. I mean, I think that's, it's interesting. I think we all bitch and moan about how partisan the media is, how biased it is, whether it's left or right or whatever. I have a different take on it. I actually think it's quite a bit better, balanced, and factual now than it's been in much of our history in America. I think we had a 30 5-year period from the 50s to the late 80s or early 90s. We had the network news television broadcasts, which was half an hour, yeah, maybe a little more lefty than righty. But they only had 30 minutes to inform the vast majority of Americans sitting around the dinner table what the hell happened today. And there wasn't 24 hours that filled with bullshit. And but I think that 30 to 40 year period of the Walter Cronkite's was actually an anomaly in American history. Because if you look at the news media before that and after that, it is hyper partisan. And even in the old days in America, newspapers were literally the arm of the political machine. First on the payroll, the politicians. We now at least have a professional journalistic class that is not perfect by any means, but it's much, I think it's much more accurate and fairer if you do your homework and you go out there and look for the sources that are not just entertainment TV 24/7. Who can we get to yell at?
I think there's less investigative journalism.
There is less of that. I agree with that.
Less versus
I agree with that. If you look at newsrooms across America, they've cut the investigative teams. They don't have as many of them. There's a premium on fast, quick, scoopy, get the thing out, and forget about the 3-month project. You know, we're not going to do that anymore. I mean, it's not like nobody's doing that. There's now ProPublica. I don't know if you check them out. That's a nonprofit that does nothing but investigative journalism. And they do some really good stuff. But if you're expecting to just sit on your couch and surf through and be an informed citizen of America, we're screwed. Because citizenship is an active sport. You got to go out of your way to inform yourself and figure out what's BS and what isn't. And not to turn this session into like journalism in the 21st century in America, but when people ask me who do you go to for sources to be informed, I say forget about news outlets. Do your research on reporters that have a track record that you trust. Follow them. It almost doesn't matter who they write for. Do they write for the New York Times? Do they work for Fox News? I think if you do your homework on individual journalists, you feel like you have a track record. They've gotten it right most of the time, maybe not all the time. They try their best to be objective. And that's the other thing. Objective journalism is not 50% for this side, 50% for that side. That is lazy. Objective journalism means there's such a thing as an objective fact. Your job is to do your best to find the objective facts. If this side is full of shit, they don't get 50%. They might get 20% because, you know, you can't leave them out completely because they're part of the conversation. And they're clearly informing lots of other people with their BS. But objective journalism is objective facts. And I'm not pretending that that's easy, particularly at the topic of UFOs. I mean, finding an objective fact in the world of UFOs is like, it's funny, when I was at the Boston Globe, I did a couple stories on some files that had come out on the Kennedy assassination. And I went to a 50th anniversary Kennedy assassination research conference. And I thought that was a rabbit hole. And the truth is, like, compared to this, like, the Kennedy assassination is like easy peasy. There's only, you know, a few possibilities, and pick your one. Anyway, UFO question. We done? Cool. I think we're. We have another 25 minutes. Story time?
Hello.
Hi.
Who's got her? Yes, I'm here. Just walk right here, that's outside.
This is a very small
So criminalizing citizens who try to investigate UFOs? I missed it. I don't understand. I mean, I guess I would have to see exactly what they said or what the context was. I mean, I guess if they meant like, I don't know, citizens trespassing over some military base to go look at the UFO. Yeah, I mean, I guess you're not supposed to trespass on Area 51, but I guess I'd have to know better what they meant by like criminalizing this being a researcher. That seems crazy. Yeah, that seems illegal. I mean, we're not a free country. Oh, the hoax. Oh, if you're purposely putting out a hoax. Yes, I do remember that. That was weird. It was weird. It was basically, one of the members of Congress sort of raised the question of, like, should we be thinking about some law or some provision that would somehow punish people for putting out a hoax? I mean, I remember thinking when I heard that, like, if you're going to do that, there's probably a whole lot of other disciplines beyond UFOs that you should be doing that for, including your own party and your own sort of right-wing media or left-wing media that puts out BS all the time. What about that? I mean, they're actually damaging our country more than people who say MK12 is real. Or is it? You want to be first? Yeah.
I was just curious just how you started you're looking at it. It seems like a few years ago, but it begs the question, is there something actually there to look at this all the time?
Yeah, Skinwalker, it's fascinating, Skinwalker Ranch. As I mentioned in the beginning, I felt a little, speaking of the question earlier about like the media sort of getting rolled or being duped into writing things that were fully true or partially true. I felt a little burn after the first stories in 2017 about the Pentagon agent office, Lou Elizondo's role, because the sources who wanted this story out, clearly in that case, that was their axe to grind, they wanted more attention on UFOs. They purposely left out a lot of the Skinwalker stuff. And I think it was because they knew that the New York Times or Politico is not going to write about the ghosts and goblins and werewolves running around Utah. And the fact that, by the way, some of the early efforts of the Pentagon UFO Office were dedicated to Skinwalker. I mean, the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, sent people there to like do studies, and that was one of the things that got Harry Reid of Nevada, the senator, all engaged in this. And so I felt a little burned that they didn't completely leave it out because you could look through public records and see that Bob Bigelow, the UFO contractor for the Pentagon, had owned Skinwalker Ranch. And obviously reporters like George Knapp in Las Vegas have been writing about it, still writing about it. So I was aware of it. Since then, I've read a lot. I read George's book, his first book, and talked to people like Colonel John Alexander, the aeronautical officer, who spent some time there. Stuff, lots of great stuff to do. I was invited there, and I decided not to go. And it's basically because I read about all this stuff. And, I joked that I called my rabbi and I said, what do you think? Should I go? He's like, no way, stay away from that place. I mean, it seems like there's enough smoke there that maybe not everybody sees all this stuff or experiences all this stuff. Maybe you need to be attuned to it somehow. But these legends, Sasquatch. When I was a kid growing up in northeastern Pennsylvania, it was the Wendigo. It was like this Native American spirit that lived in the woods on Route 115 that I was definitely afraid of going down up until I was 20 at night. I don't know, I've never been there, but I feel like there was clearly enough going on there. And some serious people were like, what the hell is that? Some people talk about these experiences and bringing things home with them that they didn't want to. And so when I was invited down, it's like, it's not really material to what I'm covering now as far as the UFO beat. So do I really need to risk it? I don't know, what do you think?
I don't know. There's data that's limited, right? Just like I said, I question is there's people who own the property so quickly, it really wasn't full mind. You see a lot of crowds data
Yeah, I mean, I do think that in that case too, they probably didn't have a lot of really good answers, right? I mean, by definition, it's like, I don't know what this is, but here's what we found or recorded or experienced. And somebody was telling me earlier that is pretty knowledgeable and has pretty good guidance in Congress. And they don't want to hear about this anymore. Marco Rubio told me. He knows that that's part of the backstory. He knows that that's there. But I think there's a very real concern. We talk about the stigma. You know, the last thing they want to be talking about is ghosts and goblins running around Utah. I'm curious what Mitt Romney thinks about Skinwalker Ranch. I mean, he's been pretty vocal about the need to research UFOs. And he's on some of these committees. And he's senator for Utah. So, you know, is he coming? People don't have seen him. I covered him, you know, he was governor of Massachusetts. I spent like 9 lives when I was in Washington. So I covered him quite closely back then. I haven't really talked to him about UFOs, but it's interesting. You guys should check out this thing called the UAP Guide, which is online now. The gentleman who started is here today. He's here this weekend. The reason why I bring it up is since I'm talking about politicians. The UAP Guide is it's sort of like a 15-minute primer where it provides a lot of clips from everyone from President Obama, Clinton, politicians talking about UFOs, and then various other sort of resources. And it's really geared towards people that are kind of skeptical or don't know a whole lot about the phenomenon. And what it does, I guess, is it sort of gives you this 15-minute primer, then you take a little test, brief group of questions, and then I guess they sort of crunch the data. And one of the things that you crunch was, there's like maybe a dozen clips from politicians, Marco Rubio on 60 Minutes, President Obama, I think Clinton, both Clintons, a bunch of others. And the person that most people resonated with the most, thought was the most compelling and believable was Mitt Romney, for some odd reason, of all the politicians. And so yeah, I don't know what they it's something big part of the story. He's folksy. He's also name recognition. I mean, people know who he is when you look at him.
So shows like Skinwalker Ranch and the History Channel, they kind of got this style, this programmatic, repeats a lot of information. Travis Taylor news dropping. I think a lot in the community are really concerned about the credibility of that UAP task force because he is tied to the shootings.
So Travis Taylor, if you're not aware, sort of the new, very interesting wrinkle in this story, just in the last couple of weeks. So he, as you mentioned, is about ancient aliens. Ancient Aliens, right? That's the show. He's a PhD. What's that? He's not a bunch of. But he's a PhD. He's a scientist, and is sort of this swashbuckling kind of ex-intelligence military guy who's on the hunt for UFOs. And it turns out that he was at least one time in the last couple of years the title they're throwing around as chief scientist, or he's at least some official consultant to the Pentagon's UAP UFO task force. And I think, as you said, that sort of raised concerns, I think, among people, but I think for sort of a couple of different reasons. I think, as you mentioned, some people are worried that, oh my God, the Pentagon's going to some guy like that who's on ancient aliens, like not very scientific and lots of theorizing and, holy crap, we're in trouble, nothing's going to go off the rails. My reading of it is different. I actually think that because of what I said earlier about the lack of institutional knowledge, the fact that within the government, or in most of these government agencies, there really is no UFO office, no UFO analyst, no UFO nothing. Nobody dedicated to actually having this as their level of expertise, or focus of expertise. I think it's forced the government, especially now since I've kind of got under so much pressure from Congress, to find answers, to collect data. I think they're kind of doing what they always do, is they're going out and finding the people they think might know something about this. Because we don't really have internally the resident expertise. And as an example, I'll tell you, a few months ago, or whatever it was, I went to the McMinnville UFO Festival in Oregon. They have every year. They also had a conference. And after I gave a talk, a woman came up to me. I don't want to reveal specifically who she was or where she worked, but it was very clear, and I was able to sort of corroborate. She is an intelligence analyst for a very secretive U.S. military organization. Maybe in her early 40s. Was military, then went into government services. Her job as an intelligence analyst is to like track the Chinese and all kinds of other things. But recently she was given a portfolio for UAPs. Her boss said, Congress wants answers. We're an organization within the firmament that needs to be contributing to this. You're now the UAP person. And I was like, well, this is kind of a weird place for you to go, right? To McMinnville, Oregon for the UFO Festival parade. And she's like, yeah, but I went to my boss and I said, you know, it's not official travel. I want to go because I don't know anything about this world. Like, you know, I need to start getting my head around. And it's sort of like I said at the beginning, like when I came to this, who are the credible people? What books do you read? How do you know what's BS and what's not? And so I look at Travis Taylor as part of that phenomenon where I think there's no way they didn't know he was on these TV shows. Of course they did. And whoever was the guy who decided to hire him was probably like desperate for this people who know something. Get some people in the room that have been immersed in this stuff. And, you know, was he the best choice? I don't know. I saw the interview with him. I was kind of impressed when he was talking about some of the videos that they captured and that sort of thing. Mermaids? It's not. I mean, my daughters, my 12 and 13-year-old daughters would be thrilled to know if there were mermaids. I have not been covering the mermaid beat. I mean, you know, I was on the show. I think most of them are mockumentaries. I mean, I think individually there are probably shows that, depending on who the producers are, depending on who the writers are, you know, trying to really stick to the factual record. But it's TV, it's Hollywood, and it's cable, and you're constantly competing for you know, the most outlandish, oh my God, can you believe what we discovered? You know, I was on the show Unidentified, the first season, and I thought that was less a mockumentary because it stuck to kind of the players, including Lou Elizondo and others who've been involved in bringing the UFO issue and the challenges in recent years to the fore. I think by following them around, as they were investigating and asking questions, I think kind of sort of kept it a little bit grounded, as opposed to just a show that's going to go all over the place now, a different episode every time about a different conspiracy theory. But even unidentified, I sat and did an interview with the crew in Washington for maybe 3 hours. And I was amazed that I was in every episode in the whole first season. I mean, they basically took the 3-hour episode and sliced and diced it. It sort of sewed me in as if I was like a whole character. And so, that sort of surprised me, but it was also a reminder that, they're really good at weaving this stuff together. I recently watched, you guys probably know, Stephen Greer. And I know there's lots of different opinions about him and his work on UFOs. But there was a recent documentary that I probably wouldn't have even spent the time watching, but my uncle, who's a total UFO aficionado, sent me a message. It's like, oh, you got to see this Stephen Greer documentary on Amazon. So one night I had nothing better to do, and I watched it. And it was entertaining. Well, I took notes every time during the documentary where the narrator said something very outlandish, and then they would go to a very small, almost meaningless clip from the person that they were interviewing that sort of rhymed or underscored what the narrator had just said. But that person had never said it. It was just used as if this person was confirming what this narrator just said. Way out of context. But again, done in a way where if you're not really looking for that, paying attention, it's like, wow, this is incredible stuff. And so at the end, I sent my uncle this long email about it. I was like, yeah, it was really entertaining, but all of the great revelations were said by not a single fucking person. They actually put on camera. They were said by the narrator, and then they sort of sewed in. Yeah, really, it's a big problem. After the person, is alien bodies in the ground? Yeah, it's a really big problem. That's the clip from the interview. That's not journalism. That's not documentary. That's an opinion. Well, even if he was, exactly. You could walk more, maybe not quoted if you're just talking about the challenge of finding the answers to UFOs. That was the question. Yeah, it's really challenging. It's really long, and people don't know. But, if you slice that right after somebody says something really outrageous and silly, you're not really paying attention, you're just following. It's, people believe it. People think, wow, I just saw the Sail History Channel, can you believe? Maybe it is true, but it's not true because the shows you said it. Anyway, how are we doing, guys? Time, 7 more minutes. Any more questions? Lou, no questions from you? You have your chance. Normally I ask you questions.
I'm a little personal. This is supposed to be about.
Okay. You guys are in for a treat. I encourage you to stick around. Because none of us, well, certainly me, and maybe even some of you would not be here had it not been for Louis Elizondo, somebody who felt strongly that this is a subject that the American people need to be more engaged with, politicians need to care more about, and I think a lot of what we're seeing and a lot of what I've been writing is sort of the snowball effect that came from him coming forward. So with that, maybe take a bathroom break and lose up in 5 minutes. Or no, 4 o'clock. Take a half-hour break and come back at 4. Thanks for coming. Hey folks, I'm coming on in about 30 minutes, take your time, but let me just say something real quick. I appreciate the kind words that Bryan Bender said about me, but the truth and reality is we also would be having this conversation if it wasn't for the courage of some of the folks in the media, mainstream media, in this particular case, a seasoned national security correspondent for none other than Politico, to decide to buck the system and report on something that is typically be considered taboo, and his colleagues probably would consider professional suicide. and yet he decided to jump into the airlock and do it. And as a result, here we are today. Congress has passed law. We're having annual reports to Congress. DOD has policies now requiring reporting of this, and there's going to be reports coming out to the American people because people like him decided to report on this information for people like us. So I would like to give him a round of applause.
If you liked this video, be sure to check out our other content and get connected on our page and social media sites. Every day, new discoveries are being made all across the world and beyond, so let's work together to find out what's next. And remember, we won't know if we don't go. I'll see you in the vortex.